Yeah, I'm rather nervous to come after people who have actually done things. Just some. You can think of me as a break between speakers because I really don't have a point to make here. Um, thanks. Um, well, I just have a few questions, and I think they are rather interesting. And I'm using cue cards because I didn't really have, as you see, much time to prepare. So the question I'm asking essentially is enlightenment Googleable? Or can it be Googleable sometime soon? Wouldn't it be great to one day wake up and ask Google what's the meaning of life and get an exact answer that needs no further interpretation? Google will have to get its grammar right, though, because it does not consider and the and the articles. And when you ask the question, you don't want to be told that meaning of life is the name of a book or a film, because you didn't ask what is meaning of life. You asked what's the meaning of life. And it's the old Gujarati in London joke about this Guju asking the Englishman, what is time? And the Englishman says, well, you asked a very deep and imponderable question. So Googleability of enlightenment. Is that even an appropriate question to ask? For it suffers from a naive presumption that enlightenment is this final state of attainment after which there cannot be any further enlightenment. And a more reasonable view seems to be of enlightenment as a constantly evolving, constantly spiraling, constantly moving on worldview, trying to become more and more holistic with each new theory containing the truth of its predecessor and more. So it's nothing more than a catchphrase, really, my topic, to keep you engaged for a while I meander from one idea to another in this public introspection. The real underlying question is, can all knowledge there is to attain be attained? Whether that knowledge can lead to perfect happiness or bliss is another question altogether. Yeah, so there are a few points like that. So what I'm really trying to do here is meander around, try and engage some ideas. In Zen, they say before you study Zen, rivers are rivers and mountains are mountains. Things are pretty simple, rivers are rivers. While you're studying Zen, while you're going through the motions of refuting and rejecting and deconstructing and experimenting with life and truth, rivers are not rivers and mountains are not mountains. And once you're enlightened, rivers are rivers and mountains are mountains. We use words like cheeks, elephant, toothpick, God, practically every day. Well, not every day, but they're commonplace. But say, do you reckon a sentence like this could have ever been formed before? After finishing an elephant for breakfast, all that the gods longed for was a toothpick. Add to that some sexuality, and you have what stand-up comics use for the blush effect. After finishing an elephant for breakfast, all the gods longed for was a toothpick and a vagina. The elephant god appeared at his breakfast table, and his cheeks turned the inside of an elephant's vagina. The permutations can be many. You can move from the known to the unknown. And so what we are essentially looking for is just a permutation of words, isn't it? It's amazing how we expect the very finite words of our finite vocabulary to one day suddenly arrange themselves in a way that they'll yield the perfect answer to, well, life, universe, and everything. Maybe it's an equation we're looking for. Maybe it's a number, 42. The great computer deep thought in the Douglas Adams classic insists that the answer to the life, universe, to the ultimate question of life, universe, and everything is indeed 42. But it asks, what's the question? So maybe the answers are already out there, Googleable already. But are we entering the right search keywords? Are we asking the right questions? Take an example, the classic Boris story about about this great cartographer who's been summoned by the king to make the perfect, precise, ultimate map of the kingdom. The final ultimate Google map, the final all-encompassing answer after which no further questions can be asked. And the cartographer sets out in this really ambitious project, like we have in a way, adding detail upon detail in this giant ever-growing map. And the map keeps growing, and each time he's done charting out one territory and moved on to another, the first territory has been modified. So for the map to be perfect and precise, he has to incorporate those changes. So the map is constantly ever growing. It's growing across time and space till the map replaces the kingdom itself. And well, it's rather far-fetched to imagine that the World Wide Web will replace world anytime soon. But it's not beyond the scope of our imagination right now that all of an individual's experiences, memories, emotions can be archived in cyberspace. I'd once worked for an idea company, and I'd created this idea for cell phone software. The idea was pretty simple. You're made to fill up a form, a rather exhaustive form, the kind of forms you fill up in personality tests and EQ tests online on Facebook and stuff like that, but much more exhaustive than that. It takes probably hours and hours to fill up a form like that. It asks you all sorts of questions it can ask about you, your likes, your dislikes, your tastes, your opinions, your worldviews, trying to translate your personality into a code. And this unique code is put up on a giant server that your cell phone communicates with. The next step is you set up a level from Business Finder to a rather cheesy Soulmate Hunter level. And now, each time you cross somebody who's a potential soulmate, who shares your views, your opinions, or compliments them, or challenges them, depending on the level you have set, both your phones beep, and you have the option of messaging each other. And the basic idea is simple. So often must we be crossing people who otherwise would greatly enhance our lives and we theirs, and it might be a good idea to not miss out on them. But the point here is human history is being documented like never before. The cultural exchange that has happened in the last decade surpasses past centuries. The tools to record human histories, to record personal histories and experiences are available to more people than ever before. And I think the map story is a great metaphor for our quest for meaning. The answer will either have to be the scope of the question itself, this vast place we meander in, or maybe just an arrow sign, a pointer, a very small pointer. But historically, it has failed us over and over again, this quest for meaning, this obsession with the final answer, because it seems to be fundamentally flawed, this idea that there can be one final answer. If there had to be a map for a question of this scope, it will have to be ever evolving, changing, transforming, and it's pretty evident that it will need the rigor of scientific thought to attain it. But what we also need is a map for the map, and that is where I feel I might have some role to play. I mean, trying to find meaning in what I'm doing as a filmmaker, as an artist. And I think art becomes that spyglass, becomes that search glass, that telescope, that microscope for the society. One of the ideas that I have here is an idea that a friend has given me. It's a corollary to the monkey and the typewriter theorem. I mean, all of us are aware of the monkey typing randomly at the typewriter. What are the chances that it will end up producing Hamlet? Now, you were to imagine you take a handful of grain and throw it on a patch of floor. Now, what are the chances that the grain will fall in a pattern that looks somewhat like your face? The chances of that happening, however rare, do exist. It seems impossibly rare that something like that can happen, but the chance does exist. And in the Godzillion possibilities that the grain can arrange itself in. There might be a few 100,000 patterns that you can recognize. But there are hundreds of thousands of patterns that don't mean anything to you, that do not resemble anything that you've previously seen before. What I'm trying to suggest that it's pretty obvious that these patterns are as unique as the ones that mean something. And looking from within the pattern, looking from within this randomness of pattern, they start making meaning. They start having some kind of meaning for us. And that's the nature of the answers we're looking for, I believe. So instead of joining the dots, it might be more reasonable to enjoy the dots for what they are. Spontaneous, ever-growing, random. If I were to give you a line from Eliot, here I have this very nice quote from Eliot. That corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to... That's my film poster, by the way. That corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Now, it's a reasonable response for a line like that. What does it mean? But if I were to play you some piece from Beethoven, if I were to play you an infernal elevator version of Fiorelli's, and you were to ask, what does it mean? It won't make any sense, a question like that. And that's probably the reason why all art aspires to a state of music, where experience is not hindered by context. And the context, as we know, is this. We are an insignificant bunch of atoms living on this wet rock, speeding around a feverish yellow star in a galaxy of billion stars, in a universe of billion galaxies. Nature is not teleological. We know it does not have purpose or design. So, in other words, we'll be arrogant pricks to believe that the universe laid up to us to be able to answer intelligent questions about itself. And we, in our own way, try to find meaning in this obvious meaninglessness. And culture, with its euphemisms and songs, helps probably find that meaning. There's this giant wiki mirroring a giant universe, both constantly evolving, but then you'd need a map for the giant wiki. And I think poetry and music and art and stories give us that map to that giant wiki. There's a man that's running mad through the woods, a snake chasing it. The man keeps running and running till he reaches the edge of the cliff. He starts going down the cliff. He slips and he clings onto this branch with all his might. And the snake is still closing in, and he sees that the ground below is not too far. He'll probably break a bone or two if he takes the leap, and is contemplating whether to take that leap or not. A lot of us have been in the situation in life where we are contemplating whether to take that leap or not. And just then he hears the lion's roar coming from the ground. He doesn't see the lion, but he hears the lion's roar. The snake closes in. He hears the lion's roar, and the branch that he's clinging to starts dangling. And in the midst of all this, he sees a beautifully blossomed cherry on the branch. He plucks it, eats it, and attains bliss. Now, many of us have heard this story before. We have heard this parable before, and that's a part of my illustration, that we need metaphors to access facts. We need stories to access truth. We need imagination to access this giant wiki we have been evolving. I'll just come to the basic story without come right to the point. I'm going to skip quite a few things because I've written quite a few bits of things that I wanted to share. Right, so one of the things that I really want to share that has got nothing to do with art or cinema or culture or the Googleability of enlightenment is this idea that I just recently came across, and I think it's practically brilliant. The basic operating question here is, again, the fundamental of questions: who we are, what are we made of, and it's pretty interesting to know that we are born sterile as human beings, and only within hours we are inhabited by billions and billions of bacteria. By the time we reach adulthood, there are practically almost 10 times more bacteria in our body than living cells. It won't be unreasonable to say that we won't be able to survive without the bacteria in our body. So it won't also be probably unreasonable to imagine that what we know as mind, what we know as our thinking center, is a cumulative function of the living cells and the bacteria. How do we know what we are thinking is not what we are thinking, but what the bacteria wants us to think, for example. And I'll give you an example that I've recently come across, and it's rather amazing that, if I can find the page, that is, of course. Yeah, so this is from Wikipedia, okay? If you were to look at the resemblance of collective intelligence at the level of a single cellular level, the proposition I'm making would not sound as absurd. Check this out. Cordyceps unilateralis. It's a parasitoid fungus. Oh. Now, the fungus's spore enter the body of the insect, usually an ant, through respiration, through its respiratory spiracles, where they begin to consume the non-vital soft tissues. When the fungus is ready to spore, its mycelia enter the ant's brain and start changing the way it perceives pheromones. The fungus's spore start telling the ant where it's getting its smell from. So the ant becomes a zombie ant, it gets ostracized from the society, and then it's completely thrown out. So the ant, all the ants are going one way, thinking, following the trail of the pheromones, and this zombie ant goes the other way, thinking, oh yeah, that's right, and pretty sure of itself for sure, like we are, right? And the ant goes up, and this fungal spore drives the ant up on a plant, takes it 20 feet above a plant, constantly. The ant is still alive. The ant is still believing that that's where the smell of the pheromone is coming from. Okay, it's being driven by the fungal by just manipulation of smell in its brain. It goes up the plant. It goes onto a leaf and bites on the vein of the leaf with all its might, with an abnormal force, with more force than it's usually capable of, so that its mandible gets stuck into the vein of the leaf, and now the fungal spores start multiplying, feeding on the tissues of the ant from inside, leaving the exoskeleton as it is, and using it as a monument that it builds to itself. And then it starts growing out of the body of the ant, multiplying, waiting for the wind to carry it so that it can reproduce further. Now, there are hundreds of thousands of these stories told to us by nature, and I think that's where the responsibility of the artist comes in, to tell these stories. This story, I don't think, requires any further interpretation than the ones I've already probably made, but that's where I reconcile my responsibility as a filmmaker, as a storyteller, as probably a scientist to discover and deconstruct, as a philosopher, and as an artist to tell if it's beautiful. Thank you.